The basketball world didn't just react to this news, it froze. Because the same program that told Caitlin Clark she wasn't ready just handed her the keys. Not a quiet invitation, not a gradual leadership role. Full captain, face of Team USA. And the most unsettling part wasn't the decision itself. It was how uncomfortable everyone looked while it happened. This wasn't a celebration. It felt like a surrender. The announcement didn't come wrapped in hype or unity. No emotional buildup. No proud smiles. Just a blunt statement delivered in a room, so tense you could almost feel people holding their breath. The head coach stood at the podium and said the words, but her tone didn't match the moment. No warmth. No excitement. Just obligation. And then there was Caitlin, standing in the background, eyes wide, posture stiff, like someone who had just been handed something heavy, not something shiny. This wasn't the look of a player who fought for the title. This was the look of someone who didn't expect it, and maybe didn't want it this way. Because just a year earlier, this same staff was publicly explaining why Caitlin needed to wait her turn. Why experience mattered more than hype. Why chemistry couldn't be disrupted for one player, no matter how talented or popular she was. Now suddenly, she's the leader? That kind of reversal doesn't happen organically. It happens when something breaks behind the scenes. And if this were really a feel-good redemption story, the room would have felt different. The veterans would have been there. The energy would have shifted. But instead, the silence was loud. No visible support. No passing of the torch. Just Caitlin and the coach, standing apart like two people forced into the same decision from opposite sides. Which raises a question no one wants to ask out loud. When the people who kept you out suddenly put you on top, is that trust? Or is it pressure dressed up as honor? Because to understand why this moment feels so off, you have to rewind to the decision that started the firestorm in the first place. And that story is where everything really began to crack. That summer wasn't supposed to be historic. But one decision turned it into a fault line that split women's basketball straight down the middle. When Team USA released its Olympic roster and Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it, the explanation came fast and defensive. This wasn't about talent, they said. It was about chemistry, experience, paying dues. The kind of language institutions use when they want a decision to sound final and unquestionable. They framed it like a lesson. Caitlin was too young, too new, too untested against international physicality. The veterans, they argued, had built something delicate over a decade, a rhythm that couldn't be disturbed by one player, no matter how loud the crowd was cheering for her. And at first, that framing worked, at least inside the building. But outside, everything exploded. Fans didn't just disagree. They revolted. Sports shows ran segment after segment. Social media turned into a non-stop argument. Some called it arrogance. Others called it gatekeeping. And a growing number of people started asking the uncomfortable question no one in charge wanted to hear. If Caitlin Clark isn't good enough for Team USA, then what exactly are we watching every night? The backlash wasn't polite. It was relentless. And the coaching staff responded the only way institutions usually do when challenged, by doubling down. They held their ground. No apologies. No reconsideration. Just silence, followed by results. Team USA won gold. And the leadership treated that medal like a shield. They stood on the podium with hardware around their necks, pointing to the outcome as proof that they were right all along. The system worked. The hierarchy mattered. The program was bigger than any one player. End of discussion. Or so they thought. Because here's the part that rarely gets talked about. Winning didn't end the argument. It froze it. The gold medal quieted criticism, but it didn't erase resentment. It didn't bring in new fans. And it didn't stop the sport from changing around them. While Team USA was celebrating continuity, the league itself was undergoing a shift that no medal could slow down. Caitlin Clark wasn't fading into the background. She was becoming unavoidable. Sold-out arenas, record-breaking viewership, jerseys flying off shelves, games pulling numbers that women's basketball had never seen before. And suddenly, the player who supposedly didn't fit the system was driving the entire conversation. That's what made the reversal so jarring. Because less than 18 months later, we went from she disrupts chemistry to she defines our leadership. And nothing about the basketball timeline explains that jump. She didn't gain a decade of experience overnight. The veterans didn't suddenly age out all at once. The international game didn't magically change to suit her style. So if the reasons stayed the same, and the outcome flipped completely. Then the truth has to live somewhere else. And that's where the story stops being about basketball and starts being about leverage. Because once you follow what changed, you stop asking why now and start asking who forced it. And that's where things get uncomfortable. If you strip away the headlines and look at this logically, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing about Caitlin Clark's game suddenly changed. She didn't wake up one morning with new instincts. Her shooting didn't evolve overnight. Her understanding of the game wasn't radically different from the version that supposedly wasn't ready less than 2 years earlier. And the veterans? They didn't suddenly decide to step aside out of generosity. Hall of Famers don't quietly hand over leadership roles they spent a decade earning. That's not how elite sports works. That's not how human nature works. So if the basketball reasons didn't change, and the people didn't change, then something else did. Leverage. Because while Team USA was standing still, the gravity of the sport shifted in a way the program couldn't ignore anymore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player. She became the engine pulling women's basketball into a different era. Ratings followed her. Cameras followed her. Casual fans, the ones institutions depend on but rarely understand, followed her. When Caitlin played, people tuned in. When she didn't, they didn't. And that's the part no one likes to admit out loud. The national team might represent tradition and prestige, but prestige doesn't pay the bills. Attention does. And suddenly, Team USA was facing a quiet but dangerous problem. Outside of Olympic cycles, interest was flattening. Meanwhile, the league, powered by one player, was exploding. That imbalance creates pressure. Not the kind you address in a practice gym. The kind that shows up in boardrooms. Because once viewership becomes uneven, conversations start happening behind closed doors. The kind that don't involve coaches or locker rooms. The kind led by executives, broadcasters, and sponsors who see the sport not as a culture, but as a product. And from there, the logic becomes ruthless. People don't tune in for systems. They tune in for stars. Insiders have been whispering that this sudden captaincy wasn't born in a film room or a strategy meeting. It was born in negotiations. In quiet sit-downs where numbers were placed on tables and futures were weighed. The message, allegedly, was simple. Adapt or become irrelevant. Because without Caitlin Clark front and center, the program risked losing something far more valuable than a game. It risked losing its grip on the conversation. And once attention drifts, funding follows. That's what makes the press conference make sense in hindsight. The stiffness. The lack of warmth. The way the coach delivered the announcement like a formality instead of a celebration. It didn't feel like pride, it felt like compliance. Almost like the decision had already been made somewhere else. And the coach's role wasn't to choose, but to execute. Which explains why the announcement landed so awkwardly. Why it felt rushed. Why no one seemed emotionally prepared for it. Because this wasn't a basketball promotion. It was a strategic correction. They didn't crown Caitlin because they suddenly believed in her. They crowned her because they needed her gravity. But here's where the story shifts from institutional pressure to something far more personal. Because according to multiple leaks, this decision didn't end with a press release. It led to a meeting that no cameras captured. A conversation that redefined the power dynamic completely. And what allegedly happened in that room is the part no one can stop talking about. This is where the story stops feeling speculative and starts feeling inevitable. Because once money enters the room, idealism usually leaves. Behind the scenes, whispers began circulating that the coaching staff wasn't driving this shift at all. They were reacting to it. And the pressure wasn't subtle. It was structural. Broadcast partners, major sponsors, and high-level executives were all staring at the same data and drawing the same conclusion. Caitlin Clark wasn't optional anymore. The numbers told a story no press conference could spin. Games featuring Caitlin were outperforming expectations by massive margins. Ticket demand surged. Merchandise numbers jumped. Even casual viewers, people who never watched women's basketball before, were suddenly invested. And then those same people tuned into national team games and disappeared. That contrast mattered. Because for the networks footing the bill, stagnation is a warning sign. Olympic spikes are nice, but they're temporary. What executives care about is sustained relevance. Year-round interest. Momentum that doesn't evaporate once the medals are handed out. And Team USA, for all its dominance, wasn't delivering that anymore. According to insiders, Meetings started happening that had nothing to do with lineups or rotations. These were conversations about visibility, about star power, about whether the national team was becoming disconnected from the very audience it claimed to represent. The alleged message was blunt. If Caitlin Clark isn't front and center, if she's just another name on the roster, or worse, not there at all, the casual viewer checks out. And when the viewer checks out, everything downstream takes a hit. Primetime slots, sponsorship leverage, long-term funding. Suddenly, this wasn't about fairness or merit. It was about survival. And that's why the decision moved fast. No slow rollout. No gradual integration. Straight to captain. Because making her one of many wouldn't solve the problem. They needed a signal. A public declaration that the program wasn't resisting change anymore. It was embracing it. That's also why the coach's body language told such a different story than the headline. This wasn't a proud mentor passing the torch. It was an employee delivering a decision that had already been finalized. The stiffness, the lack of eye contact, the way she read from notes instead of speaking from the heart. All of it suddenly makes sense when you realize this announcement wasn't meant for the locker room. It was meant for the people watching from above it. But here's the twist that makes this even more uncomfortable. Because after the decision was locked in, after the public narrative was set, the coach still had to do one thing no executive could do for her. She had to face Caitlin, alone. And that meeting, the one that happened just hours before the announcement, is where the entire power dynamic flipped. Because according to leaks, it wasn't a celebratory conversation. It was a confession. And what was said in that room reframed the captaincy from an honor into a responsibility no one else wanted to carry. By the time Caitlin Clark got the message to report to the coach's office, she wasn't thinking about leadership. She was bracing for impact. Sources close to the situation say her first assumption wasn't promotion. It was trouble. Another warning. Another reminder about tone, comments, or stepping outside the carefully controlled narrative. After everything that had happened the year before, that expectation made sense. But what waited behind that door wasn't discipline. It was desperation. According to people familiar with the meeting, this wasn't a group discussion. No assistants. No veterans. No witnesses. Just Caitlin and the same coach who once explained, publicly, why she didn't belong yet. And the tone, allegedly, wasn't cold this time. It was vulnerable. The rumor is that the coach didn't lead with authority. She led with reality. Acknowledging something the program rarely admits out loud. The gap is closing. International teams are faster. Deeper. More organized. And the dominance that once felt automatic now requires something extra to sustain. The old guard is aging. The margins are shrinking. And the pressure isn't coming from opponents alone. It's coming from relevance. That's when the conversation reportedly shifted. Caitlin wasn't being asked to lead because she had climbed the ladder. She was being asked to lead because the ladder was wobbling. The program didn't just need her shot-making. It needed her gravity, her ability to pull eyes, cameras, and attention wherever she went. Not as a scorer, as a shield. If the team struggled, her presence would soften the blow. If cracks showed, the spotlight would stay on her instead of the structure behind her. That's the unspoken reality of star leadership in moments of transition. And Caitlin, by all accounts, understood exactly what was happening. She didn't interrupt. She didn't negotiate. She didn't ask for guarantees. She listened. Quietly. The way someone listens when they realize they're being handed responsibility, not reward. The captaincy wasn't framed as a celebration. It was framed as necessity. And that's what made the moment so uncomfortable. The same institution that once told her to wait her turn was now asking her to carry weight they no longer wanted to hold themselves. She didn't ask for the role. She didn't campaign for it. And she didn't push back, because saying no to Team USA isn't really an option. Not when the request is wrapped in patriotism and framed as service. But accepting it meant stepping into something far heavier than a title. Because Caitlin wasn't just walking back into the program. She was walking into a room that didn't fully want her there. And the moment word of the decision started to spread, that tension didn't stay behind closed doors. It leaked. Straight into the locker room. And that's where the fallout began. You can measure approval in modern sports by what people don't say. And when the news broke, the silence was immediate. No celebratory posts from veteran leaders. No public congratulations. No welcome to the role messages from the players who had been waiting years for that moment themselves. The group chats, according to insiders, went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. In a league where everything is documented, shared, and reposted, that absence wasn't accidental. It was a message. To understand why this decision hit so hard, you have to understand the culture of Team USA. Leadership there isn't supposed to be inherited. It's earned through cycles of commitment, years of camps, tournaments, sacrifices made without guarantees. The captaincy is a symbol of loyalty as much as talent. And now, that symbol had been handed to the player many of them still saw as an outsider. For some veterans, this wasn't about jealousy. It was about legitimacy. They believed the role had been redefined without their consent. That tradition had been traded for attention. And worse, that their own years of investment had been quietly devalued. Whispers started almost immediately. Frustration. Private conversations. Questions about whether this was still the same program they had committed to. Some insiders claim a few older players are already weighing their options. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Because once trust erodes, the math changes. Why stay if leadership can be reassigned overnight? Why sacrifice if hierarchy no longer matters? The divide became impossible to ignore. Younger players, many of whom grew up watching Caitlin, saw this as evolution. A necessary shift. A sign that the program was finally aligning with the future of the sport. For them, Caitlin represented opportunity. The veterans saw something else entirely. They saw displacement. And that tension doesn't need arguments to exist. It shows up in body language, in who gets past the ball, in who speaks during huddles, and who gets ignored. The coaching staff had effectively created two realities inside the same locker room. One looking forward, one refusing to let go. And in the middle of it all stood Caitlin Clark, wearing a title that made her both visible and vulnerable. Because leadership without buy-in isn't leadership at all. It's exposure. She knew it. They knew it. And the moment she accepted that captaincy, she also accepted the possibility that if anything went wrong, the blame would land on her first. Which is why some analysts believe this wasn't just a risky decision. They believe it was a calculated one. Because there's a name for situations like this. When someone is elevated during instability, right before things get harder. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. There's a term used in business psychology that feels uncomfortably accurate here. The glass cliff. It describes a pattern where leaders, often women, are elevated during moments of crisis, when the odds of failure are already stacked. The role looks like a promotion. The timing tells a different story. And once analysts started applying that lens to Caitlin Clark's captaincy, the picture got darker. Think about the timing. Team USA isn't at its peak anymore. The rest of the world has caught up. France, Australia, Spain, deeper rosters, smarter systems, no fear of the old mystique. The margins that used to guarantee dominance are thinning. At the same time, the core of the program is aging. Transitions are coming whether anyone likes it or not. And transitions are messy. They come with losses, chemistry issues, and uncomfortable growing pains. Now place Caitlin at the center of that moment. If the team struggles, the narrative is already loaded. She disrupted the culture. They rushed the change. This is what happens when you chase hype. The pressure isn't hypothetical. It's pre-written. If she succeeds, the establishment wins. They look adaptive, forward-thinking, brave enough to evolve. Caitlin becomes proof that the system still works. If she fails, the responsibility shifts instantly. The coach can point to fan pressure. Executives can point to ratings demands. Veterans can point to tradition. And Caitlin becomes the example. The experiment. That's the part no press release mentions. Leadership is powerful when support exists. But leadership without alignment turns into isolation. And Caitlin is stepping into a role where the applause is loud, but conditional. She knows it. Sources say she didn't celebrate the decision. She didn't post about it. She didn't frame it as validation. Because she understands something many fans don't. This isn't just about basketball anymore. This is about perception. Every missed shot will be magnified. Every turnover will be dissected. Every awkward interaction will become a headline. And if chemistry falters, the conversation won't be about institutional choices. It'll be about her. That's why some analysts believe this move protects everyone except Caitlin. The coach gains flexibility. The organization gains attention. The league gains momentum. Caitlin gains responsibility and risk. And the internet, predictably, noticed all of it. Because the reaction wasn't unified. It was explosive, polarized. Emotional in a way only sports arguments get when they stop being about games and start being about identity. And that reaction might be the clearest signal of what this decision actually represents. The reaction didn't simmer. It detonated. On one side, Caitlin Clark supporters saw this moment as overdue recognition, proof that talent eventually forces doors open. Their feeds filled with edits, celebrations, and quiet satisfaction aimed at everyone who once said she needed to wait. To them, this wasn't a gamble, it was justice finally catching up. But on the other side, the tone was sharp. Longtime fans and purists weren't celebrating. They were alarmed. They saw the decision as a warning sign, that tradition was being traded for clicks, and that leadership was being redefined by marketability instead of legacy. Some accused the program of panic. Others accused it of selling its identity. The comment sections turned into battlefields. People weren't just arguing about basketball anymore. They were arguing about what the sport is supposed to be, about whether popularity should outweigh seniority, about whether the future should be allowed to leapfrog the past. And in a strange way, that chaos proved the point. Team USA was relevant again. Everyone was watching. Everyone was talking. And from a business standpoint, the mission had already been accomplished, regardless of how messy it looked. But here's the truth that sits underneath all the noise. This decision didn't just crown a captain. It signaled a changing of the guard. The old hierarchy, built purely on tenure, is cracking. In its place is a new reality where attention, reach, and impact matter just as much as championships. That shift won't stop with Caitlin. It's going to reshape contracts, endorsements, and power dynamics across the league. For other players, this is a wake-up call. Not a threat, a signal. The game is evolving, and those who adapt will benefit. Those who resist may find themselves pushed to the margins, no matter how decorated they are. As for Caitlin, she's standing in the center of it all. Not celebrating, not retreating, just steady. She's faced pressure before, records, expectations, physical targeting, nonstop scrutiny. But this is different. This isn't about scoring. It's about leadership in an environment that hasn't fully decided whether it wants you there. That's the real gamble. If this works, it marks the beginning of a new era, one where old and new finally align, and women's basketball reaches heights it's never touched before. If it fails, it becomes a cautionary tale about rushed change and misplaced blame. Either way, this moment will be remembered. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't just named captain. She was placed at the fault line of a sport in transition. And what happens next won't just define her career. It will define where women's basketball goes from here. If you want to stay ahead of every twist, power shift, and behind-the-scenes move as this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed. These moments don't end quietly, and neither will the fallout. Because this isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning.